I just mentioned today's speaker, but I do want to say thanks to them. TRN USA is our speaker today. You're going to hear from Chief Inspector Dana Spessert, who I've had the pleasure of working with now for 10 years. 10 years.
That's a long time.
Dana was born into the lumber industry, beginning his career working at his family-owned sawmill. He graduated from the Inspector Training School in 1986 and has more than 30 years of industry experience, including 5 years as a production supervisor and 9 years as a quality control manager before he joined NHLA. As the chief inspector, he's responsible for maintaining the integrity of our NHLA grading rules and supervising his team of national inspectors that are out in the field working for you every day. He also serves as the dean of our NHLA Inspector Training School, although I don't really know exactly what that means, but he is over there working every day. In fact, bringing in some new lumber yesterday for the school. So with all of that, Dana, are you ready to get the show started?
I am ready. I'm going to share my screen here so I can use the fancy stuff.
I do also want to say that Dana is going to take questions throughout his presentation, so there'll be some opportunities for a stop and take questions. If you'll put your questions in the chat, then we will get to it. Thanks.
Thank you, Renee. I appreciate that. I would like to just mention a couple of things to start with. I realize there could be some questions out there. What's the chief inspector have any role in talking about these things? And as Renee had mentioned, I do have a lot of background in this industry and in many segments of the industry. And I will also tell you, based on what my father's definition of an expert was, and I'll give that to you, is he always said an expert is X is an unknown factor, and a spurt is a little bit of water under a lot of pressure. So I don't claim to be an expert, but I have had a lot of experience and worked with a lot of really talented and much more intelligent people than myself over the years. And through some of the things that we've started, which I'll go over those in more detail a little bit later, one being the yield analysis. For many years in my previous job, we did study a lot of logs and we studied the sawmills in detail. And we did identify a lot of things that did help, could help our operations run more efficiently in the sawmills and dry kilns. So I want to go over some of those things today. I've just chosen 4 that I feel are very important. And if they get monitored, people get an opportunity to improve the things. So, and really, I'll just go ahead and get started. And as we go along, I'll explain those. As Renee said, you'll get an opportunity to ask questions. I'll have stopping points and we'll talk about them if there's any. Hopefully, I'll describe it so much there won't be any questions. But some of this may be old hat to people. I would like to bring this back to the forefront for many people. And I also realize there's a lot of new people in our industry. They may not know some of the nuances that go along with it. So the one question, and I learned this actually from Gene Wingert not too long ago, to ask this question: what is your goal? And a lot of people may think, well, I want to turn logs into lumber. I want to take green lumber and turn it into kiln dried lumber. But if you're in business, this should be your goal. It should be to make money. And if you have that in mind, just about anything you do should be focused back on that goal. You can make the best lumber in the world, but if you're not doing it efficiently and doing it on time, you could be missing out on a lot of opportunity. So let's get into a little bit more. Here's one of the people that was actually very educational throughout the years and really started a lot of standards for the quality control and proper manufacturing was Peter Drucker. He's written a lot of books, has a lot of quotes out there in his name. And this is one of the ones that I like to go by. What gets measured gets done. Never anything more true than what I've seen recently in some of the mill studies we've done, areas get overlooked, and those are kind of things I want to talk about today. So the 4 key areas that I want to discuss today is, one is downtime. I'll get into this a lot more detail here, but it seems to be one of the areas that's really overlooked. And I understand why. I've heard a lot of the excuses. I obviously haven't heard them all, but downtime, it is a money draining, it's a money pit. So we'll talk about some of the things to look for and how to maybe have some suggestions to mitigate some of this, or at least lower the impact. Capacity utilization. We'll discuss that a little bit, see how much potential we actually could have. Inventory rotation. I know a lot of people watch this pretty close, but I've seen others that look at as inventory as inventory. And in fact, in a lot of cases, the inventory is actually part of the process. So we need to make sure we monitor that. And one of that I'll finish on will be yield. And I'll go over some of the areas that may be overlooked as a potential to gain some more yield. All right, so let's start with downtime. Tracking unplanned downtime can increase operational efficiency by as much as 20%. I've seen it actually even being more, but we'll discuss some of that here coming up. Unexpected downtime results in loss of production, increased cost, and interruptions in on-time shipments. I pulled these statements from manufacturing of any type. This is more of a studies that's done over many different types of manufacturing, not just sawmills and kiln dried yards. So the bottom line, it costs you money, and downtime is probably one of the areas we realize it happens, but I don't know that we look at it as, how can I eliminate the downtime? We accept it. We know we have saw changes and things like that are planned, but I have seen downtime to where they didn't really need to change saws. They did it because it was a normal progress. But if you're only cutting half the production because of downtime, maybe you can eliminate a little bit more downtime by not changing the saws if you don't need to. That's just one small example. So to minimize downtime, to mitigate some of the unexpected downtime, monitor equipment regularly and use preventative and predictive maintenance. I know that's a challenge. A lot of people are running older equipment, and it is a big challenge, but if there's a bearing or a belt that's squeaking or something, address it when you know there's a problem. If it could be a problem, and I can't remember, Confucius or somebody like that would say, if you know it's going to happen, go ahead and fix it. So some of those things, preventive and predictive maintenance. I know this went around several years ago at the company I worked at, where they did get computers to monitor the maintenance. One of the issues we ran into, nobody really wanted to take the time to put the information in. So that can be a little bit of a challenge, but I still think looking at the equipment, knowing how old it is, and just start going ahead and replacing things prior to it breaking down could minimize the downtime. If you can do that off hours, outside of production time, the money savings can be very significant. Ramifications of unplanned downtime are decreased with an environment that welcomes open employee communications. Welcomes open employee communications. So many times I've been around when there was a breakdown, and ultimately the worker or employee will come to me and say, I've been telling them that was going to break down for quite a while. I do realize that you hear a lot of people complain that's too much work. They have other things. It's too hot and too much dust. We hear all kinds of things. But if we can welcome these employees to let us know, I see this as a problem, you may want to look at it, and really take a look at it and make sure it is operational. And employees need to know exactly who to communicate downtime related issues to and when. Downtime cost is actually pretty simple to calculate. So you convert your costs to minutes. I know a lot of people will have a cost per thousand that their mill or drying operation runs. But if you can convert that to minutes, and how we do it when we're analyzing an operation, we will take the board foot annually. So that way it filters out anomalies, ups and downs. If we say there was 15 million board feet annually cut at the sawmill, we go and look at the cost. They say to manufacturers $250 a thousand. The annual cost for that mill would be roughly $3.75 million. So the annual operating hours, and this is an estimate again, but could be around 2,000 hours. That would be 50 weeks, 40 hours a week. Hourly cost then would be $1,875 per hour. And the cost per minute is $31.25. It is not uncommon for me to see a company or a sawmill have 20 minutes downtime and treat that as if it was no big deal. But it would be things that the head rig had to stop because a slab got stuck. Some of the parts of the belt were missing, or a roll was taken out. Maybe a chain was off. And if you look at 20 minutes at 31 minutes, $31 per minute, 20 minutes is going to be $600. So even if you had to hire a person to stand there all day at $100 a day to make sure that that did not slow that mill down or stop it, that would justify itself pretty simply. And I think by converting this into how much it costs you a minute, it makes it easier to determine, should I add something? Should I fix something to save that money? And again, this is just not the cost. This is also the loss of production, your products, and log damage. So the longer your logs, and we'll talk about that a little bit, but the longer inventory sets around, the lower value it's going to end up with. Suggestion, I like to see each machine center have a downtime sheet. It could just be a pretty simple, here's your machine, write down why it was down, how long it was down, and make sure that they do that on a regular basis. It shouldn't just be a one and done. This should just be, hey, this is your job moving forward every time your machine's down. And then create a spreadsheet in an office or even in the supervisor's office for the mill. It should create a spreadsheet and start recording this and keep up over time so that you can look at it and say, well, this machine cost me X number of minutes last month or for the year. It makes it a lot easier to justify newer equipment and to look at things that will prevent the downtime. So you track for that repeat reason and focus on elimination of the problem. I know this is old hat to a lot of people, but I will tell you in the studies we've done just in the last year and a half, we've saw this as a big problem with the majority of the companies. So I just wanted to let people know, let's not forget about how much it costs you when that mill's not actually running. So with that, I want to stop for a moment. If anybody has any questions or comments, I'd love to hear them. I do see one question here. It was, do you mean 250 1,000 manufacturing revenue? Actually, no, that would be the 250 I was referring to would be the, I can't remember about where I was at in there, but I would be talking about the manufacturing per thousand. So if your cost per thousand on an annual basis comes out to roughly $250 per thousand. So we're looking at what the cost of operating the mill is, not with the logs, just the cost of manufacturing. So I don't see any other questions on here. So
I don't see anything else, Dana.
Okay. All right. Well, I'm glad you spoke up there because I wasn't sure anybody was hearing me. So all right. Well, we'll move on, and you can ask questions about any topic even later in the presentation. So the next one I want to go over is capacity utilization. I know everybody would like to think that their mill or their kiln operation is running efficiently and everything's being used the best it can. And that would be great. So one of the first questions you'd have to ask is, all my machines operate at 100% capacity? I tell you from my experience, that's probably not happening. Could a machine be producing more product than it is currently? And some examples of this, and these are some that I've witnessed. Let's give, for instance, a resaw in feed deck. It only has half the capacity of the cants or the timbers coming over from the head saw, and that is an indication that the head saw starts feeding down the line. I've heard a lot of excuses for this. One is, I have to do that because the resaw operator gets upset if he feels like he's being overwhelmed. There is opportunities when you would maybe want to do something like this. If you're getting close to a species changeover or something like that. But in general, if you keep that resaw deck full, and also the resaw operator is feeding the machine correctly. We have had instances where they were not feeding it up to the capacity it can handle, and by as much as 50% under what it was capable of. That also was causing that backlog at the head saw. Head saw was having to cut down, and everybody knows that's going to be more expensive than a stationary saw. Also a dry kiln. See dry kilns sitting empty, or they've loaded them and they haven't fired them up yet. Every bit of that would be considered downtime. And so that, going with not being able to utilize it, it creates a backlog. Maybe for the dry kilns, maybe the lumber sits on the yard too long. And until it's kiln dried, graded, and ready to ship, it's just a cost at that point. So things like that, we want to make sure we're utilizing everything we have, all the machines at the maximum we could. You want to verify that you're achieving machine manufacturer's recommended feed rate. I cannot tell you how many times in the past that I've seen saws that were over-engineered. They would either have too big a saw curve, too much gullet capacity for a bandsaw, and they were not feeding it fast enough, and it was actually causing more harm than good. And I think any saw filer out there would tell you that if you're creating a lot of fine sawdust, you're going to create hot saws. Your saw gets hot, it's going to start deviating. If it starts deviating, you're going to create miscut lumber, or lumber that will actually create a problem downstream, either at air dried yard or in the kilns. It creates issues. Avoid falling behind by keeping detailed service records and updating your existing machinery as needed. Again, it goes back to similar thing as the downtime, but the downtime probably in the most cases causes the capacity utilization. You're having issues with certain parts of the equipment being wore out, should have been replaced. Maybe it could be just something that you knew it was going to only last a year, but you thought, well, I'll go ahead and try to get 2-3 years out of it. That can happen. We all have done it. You just want to make sure that you do catch up as quickly as possible. So again, it could be time to rebuild, replace, and look at how much is it costing you to be the way it is, slowing everything down. Maybe you want to replace it and capitalize on that production and lowering your cost. So some suggestions. I think anybody in the manufacturing world should have heard of this term: a bottleneck, a constraint. Typically on a sawmill, it's typically the head saw. If it's not the head saw, I would be looking really close at my operation and seeing why it's not the head saw. If it is the head saw, you can always potentially upgrade the equipment there, maybe put scanner systems, things like that. That does shave a few seconds off for the sawyer. But I've seen also secondary breakdowns, just like I was talking about, where the resaw is not operating efficiently, creating a backlog at the head saw. The other day I was at a mill and their gang saw was actually the holdup. And it was really the way it was set up. It had nothing to do with the machine or the way the mill was laid out. It was simply they didn't put the right saws in and didn't have the right pocket, so it was creating a big problem. Trimmers, Seen belts and transfer decks also being problems. So you should always be chasing that bottleneck. Sometimes it can be employees, undertrained employees, employees not capable of doing the job, or that just have a poor attitude in some cases. So efforts should always be made to eliminate the bottlenecks. If not, you're probably not going to be operating at the most efficient way possible. You got to keep everything flowing through, again, sawmill or dry yard. You got to keep everything moving through. So with that, I'm going to stop for a few minutes here, or a minute, and ask for any questions.
If you may have questions, please put them in the chat.
Questions, comments? You can always call me after a while and yell at me if you didn't like something I've said. Okay. Well, I don't see any. All right, so I'm going to move on. All right. Inventory rotation. What does this have to do with hardwood lumber? So wood, or trees, we'll just refer to it as wood until it turns from a tree into some lumber. Wood begins to dry immediately upon felling of the tree. A lot of people don't think about that, but as soon as you cut the tree down, actually you even start cutting into the tree, moisture starts running out of the tree. What happens then is shrinkage. As a tree dries or the logs dry, they do begin to create some other issues. So as soon as that tree's down, the clock has started on several irreversible effects of poorly handled logs and lumber. And one that comes to mind off the top of my head would be stain. In the hottest time of the year, it's very humid. The wood's not drying as fast enough. You'll get fungus get started into the log even. You will also get a lot of end checking. You also get worms and bugs that crawl into, start creating holes through the bark and into the log itself. These are all grade reducing defects that could have possibly been eliminated if everything's handled in a reasonable amount of time. I have written articles about this in the past that we know how challenging it is in this industry. When it's a rainy season, we have a hard time getting logs from the woods to the forest to our sawmills. Part of the issue is, and I was a logger for many years, when it's too wet to truck the logs to the sawmill, that did not stop us from cutting trees down. So we would stockpile our timber, our logs in the forest. Whenever we had the opportunity, it was dry enough to truck these logs to the mill, we would haul them in. So logs could be cut, stacked in the woods for up to a couple of months in certain occasions until we could get them delivered. Those logs were deteriorating the whole time they were laying there. If they were in the shade, it actually helped some. But again, as soon as you fell the tree, it starts drying. And some of the logs will dry out, and some of these end checks get pretty severe, and they are irreversible once they start. So another example is lumber sitting on the green chain over the weekend or even overnight. I know some of the whiter woods, if they're sitting for any length of time at all, can be a big challenge. The staining and you get other issues as well. But lumber sitting flat stacked for extended periods is a breeding ground for stain and checking on the top layers, or even the bottom layers for that example. So, and also for cash flow and customer satisfaction. They don't like lumber that's starting to turn dark. They don't like it if they don't get their lumber on time, and other factors. So here's a suggestion. We like to, when we do our studies, we recommend that they don't keep much more than a 30-day inventory or less when there's no wet storage available. So if you can keep it underwater for your, typically going to be your oak logs, some of those species that might be less, or like ash or something, that would be less tolerant or more tolerant of stain. Keep it under wet storage will keep some of the things happening from like bugs don't usually affect the logs too much if they're under wet storage. It also keeps from in checking and surface checking, but it does sometimes create chemical stains, and that can be from the water supply. If you have large volumes of white woods, poplar, soft and hard maple, and basswood, those need to be processed hopefully within 2 weeks or less of the time you get them. But keeping those log inventories rotated also will help. We have been to sawmills where they had 3 months of inventory, and they would have almost 30 days of sawing in one row of logs. And because of the way their log yard was laid out, they would just keep stacking the new logs in front. And of course, they would process those. Sometimes maybe it'd take them 3-4 months to ever get to the logs in the rear of the stack. That's a very poor practice, and there will be some damage, very costly damage to the logs in the back of those rows. A suggestion there I would have is turn your log yard to where you use shorter rows. Maybe you don't want more than 2 or 3 days worth of logs in any one row. Have multiple rows. I know it's a little more challenging. It might be a little more gravel and things like that, but it does save money in the long run. And when your temperatures are above 32 degrees at night, the only way to really stop staining and some of the drying too rapidly is when the temperatures get down into freezing or below. My father was in this industry, grew up in the industry as well. He always told me, son, as long as it doesn't go over 70 degrees all night, you don't have as much issue with stain. Now, he didn't say it wouldn't be there. He just suggested that when it cools off in the evenings, you would have a better opportunity to fight fungal stains and the blue stains and keep that from being an issue. For the kiln guide side and the yards, you want to keep your lumber inventory monitored for percent moisture content on the yard. I know this is not a normal practice, but if anyone's been around air drying yards and quite frankly has watched some of Gene Wingert's webinars that we've been having off and on all summer since I think March or April this year, one of them he had was on yarding, and he talks about the effects of drying too fast with check-prone species such as oak, and how much moisture content the maximum moisture content you could lose and still be able to keep the lumber from checking. He also went on to say that once you start a check, you can't really stop the check, and it never goes away. And I've heard people say, well, I can close those up in the kiln. You may be able to close them up, but they're still there. So for the most part, you got to really watch that yard, watch out faster drying species, make sure they got a lot of airflow. You might want to slow down the airflow on some of the others. The only way to truly know is to monitor the moisture content on the yard. Don't look at it as just a time on the yard, but how much moisture am I losing? So again, checkings occur at higher moisture content. Utilize different techniques to control rate of drying. You'd want to use maybe T-sheds, things like that with some shade dry or some similar type cloth. Another thing that creates warp and cupping is re-wetting lumber. Also drives checks deeper. So if it dries out, opens the check up, and it sort of sets as it gets drier, lumber that gets down around fiber saturation point, 25 to 30% moisture content, then it's going to be pretty much set. But if you re-wet that lumber, it becomes a little more pliable. It will open the checks up again and drive them a little deeper. Using rooftops and T-sheds, again, that's a great way to keep top layers and the sides of the packs from getting re-wetted, re-wetted and dried from rain and snow. Loading kilns with the same moisture content will help to eliminate or avoid cupping. And I know that a lot of people, I've been asked, well, why is my lumber all cupped? And a lot of times, the main reason is because it's gotten moisture back on dry lumber. So if it's already dried, you add moisture, it will create cup. There is some other things that go along with that. It could be where it was cut in the log, but a lot of this is due to re-wetting of the lumber. So with that, is there any questions? I know I'm going over this kind of fast, but I know a lot of you need to get back to work probably. Okay. All right. Well, I'm getting some good comments, but no questions. Must be pretty basic stuff I'm going over. Maybe I'll get into some more juicy stuff here in a second. Okay, Renee, you still on there?
Yeah. Yeah.
No questions.
I don't have any questions to feed you. So.
Oh, okay. Well, maybe I'm doing a good job explaining. I don't know.
I'm surprised that no one questioned your no more than 30-day supply of logs on the yard. I guess that went over just fine with everybody.
Yeah, well, I hope so. I'll probably get a lot of phone calls there. All right, well, I'll go on here. So the next one is yield, and this is an area that I have put a lot of years and time and effort into determining where and what can cause yield loss and how can you regain it. So manufacturers generally think of total yield as a measure of quality, but it has a huge impact on operational efficiency. One of the things I like to mention, if you recover or if you can produce all the boards from a log possible and you don't waste any part of it, say you're cutting all the boards the right thickness, then edged it properly, trimmed properly, and you can get everything out of it, you get more yield out of your logs. That also equates to production, because I hear a lot of people say, our mill, we only care about production. Well, the quality plays a big role in that. I'm not saying people really need to slow down to create more quality if they look at every process and make sure they're maximizing their yield at every point. So how does this directly affect efficiencies? A sawmill log costs account for about 70 to 80% of the overall cost of the operation. The kiln drying yard lumber costs account about 85 to 90% for the green lumber. So if you're looking at where can I make the most improvement, well, if you can take 70 to 80% of your total cost and you can get more sellable product out of that, I think that may be as productive to your company or more towards the goal of making money than increasing production. And at the same effect, if you take the same amount of logs sawn and you get more lumber to sell out of that, you have increased production. So there's different ways to look at it, but increasing it and making quality products that you can sell is the key to that, which is key to making money. Most sawmills track yield by monitoring overrun. I'm not going to sit there and say it's a horrible way to do it. It's one of the most efficient ways to measure. And the overrun, for anyone who doesn't know, it's the percentage of board footage of lumber produced from the board footage of logs consumed. So basically, the formula would be lumber footage minus log footage divided by log footage times 100 will give you a percentage overrun. A lot of cases I've seen it as high as 70, maybe even 80%. Some cases as low as 0 or even in the negatives. And a lot of that depends upon a couple factors. So issues that I have seen with utilizing overrun as the only measure of yield is log scale and accuracy is probably the number one. If your log scale is scaled 3-4% over of what the actual is, that overrun is affected directly. So if your log scale is up 1 or 2%, depending on the logs, it could cost you 10 to 12, maybe even more percent of overrun. So different types of scale used will change the overrun. Depending on whether you're using Doyle, Scribner, International, all those are types of log scales that are utilized in different parts of the U.S., but those do affect the overrun. Log diameter and length has a huge effect on it, especially in a Doyle scale. Whether you're taking deductions for sweep, rot, shake, and other defects like that has a huge impact on the overall yield and overrun. The other one that does affect, a lot of people may not consider, is the product mix. What are you cutting out of those logs affects that overall yield. So air dry yards will typically utilize the grade and tally the green lumber versus what they get after it's ready to ship. Inaccuracies in that process is the shrinkage rates are different depending on how the boards are produced, species, obviously, and a lot of people only estimate their yard tallies. They don't actually, it's very challenging to take a couple truckloads of green lumber, put them into the kiln and track them all the way through without them getting taken apart into different sections, different bundles. Typically, we don't grade and tally every bundle that goes on the yard. So it kind of loses its identity through the process, which makes that a challenge. So some suggestions that I would like to give to people, in addition to overrun, sawmills should monitor their waste for one. We have been able to work with sawmills in some different areas within their mill, and they've reduced chip production by up to 1 truckload a day. Now, those are bigger mills that run a lot of production, but if you're producing 1 less loaded chips a day, you're still processing the same amount of logs a day. You're going to be turned into lumber. So something that sells at a little higher value. Tons of chips per 1,000 board feet is a good number to know. What should I be running? I also like to say looking at your edger accuracy. We have found mills up to close to $500,000 in over edging. And I have heard a lot of arguments about, well, NHLA just wants us to go by the NHLA standard. I say absolutely we would, but more importantly, the way we're checking it, it's probably a low estimate of what you're actually losing. We are only able to check certain edging strips and waste because we don't want to be too challenging when we're doing our tests. We want to give people an opportunity to pass or get a great score. But in this case, most of the time we're underestimating that. Debarker accuracy. If our debarker operators or maybe the equipment is being too aggressive and it digs down into the wood, creating wane because they take bark plus wood off, there could be a lot of yield wasted there. Minimum opening face. That first cut is going to determine a lot about that log and how much yield you can get out of it. So you would want to make sure you determine what's the best for your logs and have a good discussion with sawyers and make sure they know what they should be looking for. Thickness accuracy. A lot of people in this business probably don't realize that for every 10,000ths of an inch, so that's 0.010, for every 10,000ths of an inch, that's 1% yield. So if you're overcutting your thickness, say you have a target for 4/4 at 1.125 or 1 1/8 of an inch. As long as you're hitting that and everything's good, but what if you decide to cut it a little bit thicker to make sure you get it? Well, if you go 10,000ths of an inch over that, or if your saw's deviating, maybe you have a thicker saw kerf than you probably should, then 10,000ths of an inch is 1% yield. So looking at those are things that they need to be monitored closely in order to effectively change them. But they are areas that you can increase your overrun. Trimmer accuracy, we do monitor that along with the edger test. Usually not a big issue unless maybe you have a trimmer that doesn't have an odd link saw. So you have odd link boards getting trimmed back basically an extra foot where they could have been capitalized on. And doing a test for lumber recovery factor. That's a little more challenging, and I'll get into that whenever I talk about a report here in just a second. But that's probably your most effective way to determine, are you achieving everything you could out of the logs? So this is for the yard side. So yards should verify and or monitor accuracy of their lumber inspectors. So if you want to know how much loss you had in grade, you need to know what was the actual grade coming in and was it done accurately. Are my inspectors getting all the potential value out of the lumber? Are they making sure when we sell it, they're selling it to maximum value? Recording avoidable defects. So a suggestion I have, if you want to increase yields to a yard or even a sawmill, have your inspectors to record avoidable defects in a dry yard. Is pretty simple. You're looking for anything that was honeycomb checked or stained, and then trying to figure out where did that happen and how can I avoid that in the future. The less of that you have, the better your yield's going to be. And in the yard, a lot of times it's grade yield, the most important thing you're looking for. Tally accuracy, is it being tallied correctly? Am I losing money there? Air dry yard practices. Talked about a little bit ago about monitoring your inventory, but in the air dry yard, we want to look at your sticker alignment. Is it creating some problems with warp and things like that? Is the bolsters aligned and things when they're stacking it up out there? It's a lot of weight setting on a board, and when it's green, it's malleable, so it will create some warp or kink, as some people call it. Is the airflow good enough to pull the moisture away so that my lumber is not staining? Is the vegetation up to where it's blocking the airflow? Should we cut the vegetation? Looking at the kiln schedules. Are we running the kilns the most efficiently? I know that years ago when most people were using gas-fired boilers, they seem to be a little more cautious about their kiln schedules and how quick they get the lumber dry. Sometimes if they're using wood waste from their own mill, they tend to get a little lax on that. So drying it as fast as you can to keep all your operation going, and that will also help. Kiln loading practices and things like that. Make sure we got it completely full, got the airflow blocked, so we don't damage any of the wood, so that it comes out at a better yield than it went in, at least as good as it went in. So with that, is there any questions on that?
Hey Dana, there was a question earlier about which log scale is best to use in the mill if you are concerned with overrun.
Well, that is a great question. So there is so much of a variance between each one. I think it comes down to what do the loggers or your competitors or other people in that area, how are they purchasing the logs and scaling them? So in other words, I think it's more regional. I find that if you go down into some of the southern mills, they're not even scaling logs. They buy it by weight. Where you get into the West Virginia area where I'm from originally, it was dual scales, all anybody talked about. And then we've done a yield study in Wisconsin. They were using, I think it was Scribner. And we've done also a study at International Quarter Inch. Studies have indicated that the most accurate is supposed to be International Quarter Inch. And so the U.S. Forest Service tends to use that because it doesn't seem to have a huge variance between the different diameters and length, but they still do. So there's no way to be ever 100% accurate with the log scale, but probably the most accurate would be the International Quarter Inch. So I hope that answers the question. But if you want more overrun, you can buy on dual scale. Smaller logs will definitely give you a higher overrun. I think in most cases, it's the price that you pay for the logs is going to be based on the log scale type you use. So it would be all relative in the end about when it comes down to making money. All right, no more questions. I'm going to move on.
Yep.
Okie dokie. So NHLA, and over the years, we primarily focused on grading lumber, teaching how to grade lumber. And what I realized with the staff that I have, the national inspectors, they have a lot of hidden talent that I know that we were not capitalizing on in the past. So with a little bit of my background and some help from many people out there in the industry, we decided, well, let's start working towards a way that we can give more value to our members. And one of the things that we did was started a sawmill yield analysis. Some of you have heard about this, but I'm going to briefly describe it. Then I'm going to show you one of the reports that we've kind of morphed into that I really like, and I think the people that have utilized it also really like the report. But for our sawmill yield analysis, we do for the process, we will find out typically from the owner of the company, what logs, what species would you like to look at? And that's primarily going to be their highest volume species, but it may be a species that they're like, I don't know if I'm paying too much. I don't know if I can make more money out of these logs. So we'll look at whichever species they want. We can do multiple tests over time and get all their species done. But we pull logs right out of their log inventory. We like to get it as random as possible so we get a good mix of lengths, diameter classes, and grade. We'll measure all the logs for length and record it by the inch so that we know exactly how long it is. We then convert it into feet so we know when we group them later. We will get the small and large end diameter, which is a little bit of a challenge sometimes when you're looking at butt logs to get that, but we try to measure the true cylinder as best we can. We'll grade it and we'll classify it by diameter based on U.S. Forest Service log grades. We like to use the Forest Service log grades for a couple different reasons. Number one, they're not based on clear faces. Their grades were based on NHLA grades and how much of the higher grades they could get based on a face. So anybody that's a lumber inspector knows a 12-foot board with a knot in the middle still can make FAS all day. So the U.S. Forest Service grades are similar to that. So we utilize those and we group them by diameter classes. We'll saw each group of diameter class and grade. So we'll have grades 1 through 3 typically, may even be a grade 4. But then we will also group those into several different diameter classes. So by having the grades by diameter class, we're able to identify for each log group how much, some different factors that I'll go over here in the next report. All the lumber that comes out is inspected by NHLA National Inspector. So we do that so that we can assure ourselves we're grading it and tallying it properly without any variance based on the talent of the inspector. So we do this so we can have a consistent across all testing, the grade out. So this is a report, and when we started out, our reporting was a little more generic, but I've really refined it into these categories. This sawmill report for this test is about 17 pages long, but this is the first sheet that would be handed to the owner after we get completed. So after we've already separated the logs, we've sawed them through the mill, we're able to calculate some different factors here. So one is we look at their inventory turns. This is going to be a number that's more critical, again, whenever you have high temperatures in the summer, humid conditions. That wouldn't be as important in the winter months. But for the example here, we say their standard target should be 30 days. They had 60 days worth of lumber or logs on their log yard. We estimated that cost to be, $134,491 annually. If they run that way all year, the loss in value of the logs through the mill would be around that. Again, it's an estimate. Every one of these estimates are aired on the side of caution. We really don't want to alarm anybody, but we just look at that as here's a potential to gain revenue if you would watch the volume of logs you have on hand. uptime for this mill, they said it was at 90%. I don't know that that was accurate, but that's what we were told. And even at only 5% off what we say the target is, they're still costing them $127,000 a year. So again, if you look at those numbers and you say, I may need another guy to keep things flowing, I'd say you could pay somebody pretty handsomely to keep it flowing if you can eliminate 5% of the downtime. We also look at productivity per man day, and really that's a pretty simple calculation. We use 2,000 board feet per day per man. Or I shouldn't say it that way, I guess today's world, and Renee may say something to him, but I should say per person, but just so everybody understands, that's employee day. For this mill, we determined it should have been 44,000 feet in a day's production. For our test, they produced 41,407 doing our test logs. If you look at the annual production up at the top, it's 6 million. But if you do the math at 41,407, that mill should have been cutting about 10 million feet a year. A lot of it was due to, had to be downtime, but I think maybe capacity utilization. So there's some things in that mill were not operating as efficient as they should. And that was some things that we go over, what we see while we're there, and to help the owner or the manager to identify areas that maybe they should focus a little more on. Everybody knows if you're not in it every day, if you're not the one fighting the alligators, much easier for you to drain the swamp. So us coming in, we have no bias towards anyone. We just look at what we see, report that back to the proper people, and let them work through the solution. The percent log overscale. In this example, the log scaler was 3.93% over what we found. So that being $85,000 annually, that's a low estimate. It was due to the species where we were checking that day, I think was a big difference. But we also can estimate the percentage of common better it should have been produced, which is going to be your higher valued lumber. They were about 12% under due to a lot of factors, but it would cost them almost $500,000 a year unless they could get that common and better percentage back up. One of the things that happens, a lot of times they'll cut double cants and things like that, which will take away some opportunity to get the higher production of common and better. Their lumber tally was pretty close. And you'll see there that last line, lumber recovery factor. That number, the standard target, is based on the actual logs they produced. The Forest Service studies that was done over many years on using the lumber recovery factor from different sawmills, different production opportunities. So that is a pretty standard at 6.49. And it's really the percentage of lumber to logs, actual going from cubic foot volume of logs to board footage of lumber. And that would be about $30,000 a year. So overall, this mill has a potential to gain $1 million a year. I don't know anybody that's on this webinar that wouldn't see that as something important. And where can I start now to get that corrected? It does happen. We've done these studies and they've came back and told me it was double what I told them whenever they actually did it. So we are pretty excited about it. Got some really good guys on my team that can identify areas in the mill pretty quickly to help. The next one that would be the log statistics, which I also like. We break this down by, in this case, they buy their logs dual scale. So it has dual footage here. Sorry about that. And with this, it indicates the break-even log value. So if you look here, it's going to show you the lumber value you got from the logs. It's going to show you, with the cost taken out, how much could I pay for a log, a 10 and 12 inch diameter log for this species at that mill, It had a 70% overrun, but it was only valued at $175. So if you only paid $175 per thousand for that log, you'd break even. If you paid $200, you'd essentially be losing $25 per thousand when you saw them through your mill. So to me, that break-even log value is probably one of the most important aspects of this study. Now, this mill did typically have a little bit higher cost than a lot of mills, but for this study, they wanted to add their kiln cost in because they were selling all the volume of lumber that they produced kiln dried. So they wanted that. But that being said, that number is extremely valuable in my opinion. So before we get any further in, do we have any questions on that? I just want to go over some other areas that we can measure to help people. Have I missed? Go ahead.
Dana, see anybody yet? If anybody has questions about any of this that Dana's just gone over, I encourage you to put your question in the chat. You can send it privately if you'd like, if you don't want to have your question out in public.
I do like the comment from Rich Solano there. Another area to monitor is customer complaints. Over time, it will tell you what areas of production is creating problems. I agree with that wholeheartedly. All right, so some other things that we look at and that we can train, educate, and or monitor is the log scaling, the grading, and the bucking of the logs. The debarker, is the debarker taking too much volume off? Is it grinding down into the fiber? Minimum opening face, we have tests where we can monitor that, measure it, and see if they're hitting the target that's set by the company. Lumber size control, again, 10 thousandths of an inch of over thickness can cost you 1% yield. So I think it's extremely valuable to be looking at that. Lumber inspection, as I mentioned earlier, when you're checking lumber inspection, or when the lumber inspectors are working, they should be monitoring, is there things that's happening that shouldn't be? Over edging, under trimming, under edging, things like that can be recorded back. Are the lumber coming out, is it stained? So does that mean we have logs setting too long? The lumber inspector is the last chance to find out what's my lumber looking like before it gets shipped out. The lumber inspector actually value recovery. Machine defects, again, recording, do they have dog marks in the middle of the board that's creating a grade deduction? Packaging, are they getting it packed? One example that was given to me once in quality control training class is they set 2 cans of green beans up from the grocery store. One was dented and one wasn't. And they said, which one would you pick off the shelf? And packaging is that important, and make sure that people are looking at your product the way it should be looked at. Dip tank, making sure we're not overcharging the dip tank, wasting chemical, or even worse, not using enough chemical, just adding water to lumber that could just create more stain. We look at the air dry yard for the stacker. Is it doing its job properly, getting the sticks put in there right? Is the forklift setting the lumber right? Is the airflow in the yard right? Is the lumber set up in the right direction? Kiln drying, we like to look at the maintenance of the kiln. Are they making sure that all the door seals are working and things like that? Are they loading the kiln properly? And just one example of our edger test that we do when we go under the mill and measure it, and it doesn't take long to do this test, but can reveal a large loss in value. So this mill here was cutting 7,000 feet per hour. We would measure, and we do record whether the edging strip came from the left or right edge. Helps to identify, is there a laser light off or something out of alignment? But this test takes approximately 5 to 10 minutes. It will tell you the total footage of what fiber was lost. We convert that to hourly. So how much would that be per hour? And then I go down at the bottom and I use 50 cents a board foot, just so that way if the species change and whatnot, but it's in the calculation to give an estimated daily and an estimated yearly value of how much money could be recovered just by correcting maybe a laser light. In a lot of cases, it's optimized edgers that we see the biggest losses. And it's not the machine, it's some of the parameters not being set properly, or the machine just needed recalibrated, realigned, and things like that. So these are things that we find on a regular basis. I would look at these numbers and say, I can't afford not to have somebody come in and look at this. And we would be more than happy to come in and help anybody. If you go to, and I believe it's NHLA under industry services, and if you go meet the team, you will find which inspectors in your area. We do have our bios on here, so that would help you to understand the expertise. But if you start with the person in your area that you most likely know which inspector, and you know them hopefully already, they can contact another inspector that may be more skilled in that particular issue, so we can communicate against ourselves, or you can call me directly and we can discuss anything you'd want us to maybe look at. And I'd like to say, when we do a study, we don't find anything wrong. That's what our hopes are. But if we do, we like to help assist in correcting and moving forward so that our companies can be stronger and better in the future. Some additional resources. Again, the educational webinars that we did earlier this year, we will continue on through the rest of the year. And I believe there'll be a normal thing moving forward. You can go and review all the ones that we've done in the past, which we've had them on sawing, edging, kiln drying, yarding. A lot of very good videos and webinars we've done recorded, and anybody has access to those. And under NHLA services, like I just showed you that last screen, that's where you would find which inspector to contact if you'd like for us to come in and work with. We can do education, we can do monitoring equipment, do a lot of different things to give you some reporting and also help things move forward. And the bottom line is, if you can't measure it, you can't improve it. And that's also Peter Drucker. And that the bottom line, you just need to be able to monitor it, you need to be able to measure it, and you need to track it. I was at a yard yesterday, and the gentleman said, yeah, we've jumped on our guys, but yeah, I'm old school too, and that's my first instinct. But I think it's better if you measure and show them, here's what I expect, here's where you stand now, and here's your road to improvement. And I think long term, that'll be a better solution, and it'll be something that'll stick around, and I think the people will be happier for it. So again, what is your goal? It should be to make money. And if it is, let NHLA help in any way we can. We're here. I'm happy to answer any questions. I did see one question here from Richard. For edger tests, do you pre-mark the board and edge it and see how it compares? We do that sometimes if we're working with an optimized edger. But I'll tell you, in general, we'll go under the mill first to the waste bed conveyor. We'll look at what's coming out without anybody aware we're down there. And the reason, we don't want them to try and do it right, because the goal is not, can they do it right? Are they doing it right is what we want to do. So I hope that answers your question. Any more questions out there?
I don't see any questions, just some comments. Mr. Workla had a comment that, downtime for manufacturing applies pretty much across the board.
Yes, I agree. And that's one of the things I try to do is look at a manufacturing process, and it could be anything you manufacture, whether it's widgets or kiln dried lumber, and use that as a basis to look at. We're not that much different from any different manufacturing process out there. but we do have a lot of nuances within. Like if you're creating widgets out of plastic, you don't have to worry about how long the plastic lays there per se. But for ours, it's more like making fresh salad, and we have to make sure that our lettuce doesn't turn bad. So there's a lot of things like that. But yes, he's exactly right. Downtime can create a lot of those issues that we went over. So any other questions? If not, I want to thank everybody for attending. I sure appreciate your time. And my email is at the bottom of the screen here. So if you have any questions, you can do that or call me. And I'll turn it back over to Renee.
Yeah. We do have another educational webinar this afternoon. Bob Graham's going to be on at 3 o'clock. It's a sales webinar. If you have anybody that at your company that you think would be a good contender for this, please have them register in advance. It's a little easier to get on if you register in advance. We want to thank TRN USA for being our sponsor today, and encourage everybody to go to the exhibit hall if you have not been. And then tomorrow we will have 3 more ed sessions tomorrow, and we kick off with our keynote speaker, Dan North, tomorrow morning. So thanks everybody for coming in and giving us your time. I know this participation can get, virtually exhausting. So we appreciate everybody being here. And please email Dana if you think your company might benefit from a visit. So.
Yep. Thank you all. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Yeah.